Cruel laughter cracked through the auditorium like thunder at close range, bouncing off glass and steel and polished wood, shoving everyone's attention toward a teenager with a damp cloth still in her hand. A red laser dot jittered across an ancient stone projected on the screen, then drifted and landed on her dark uniform as if to brand her with suspicion. 50 scholars fell silent in the fluorescent light of the University of São Paulo's main lecture hall, and in the back row, a 16-year-old girl froze beside a tray of paper cups, the scent of stale coffee and sugar clinging to the air. Before we begin this journey, a quick word to the heart watching and listening right now: subscribe, because what happens next could change how you treat people. The day had started like any other conference day. Rolling suitcases rattled across tile. Microphones were clipped. Lanyards tangled. It was the International Congress of Lost Languages, a title that had sounded glamorous on the flyers and even more important when cameras showed up at the door. The auditorium gleamed with new seats and a fresh coat of paint. Banners promised discovery. Panels promised rigor. A stone slab from the interior of Minas Gerais promised a mystery. 3 hours of collective expertise had failed to unlock it. On stage stood the university's favorite celebrity, a man whose voice had introduced countless TV segments and podcasts, a man whose smile was a brand and whose bio always mentioned 30 languages like a magician's deck of cards. The room knew him, Dr. Roberto Manzini. He wore the kind of suit that photographs well, the kind of watch that shines under lights. He kept drifting from confidence to irritation as the symbols on the stone refused his methods. He enjoyed the attention even when it scalded, because attention was his oxygen. Every laugh he coaxed kept him afloat. He made a show of scanning the crowd for ideas. He let the laser wander again. He let the auditorium stare at the girl near the trash bin as if she were a prop. His smirk carried the same digital confidence he performed on TV. A famous polyglot, a rare inscription, a stage, and a convenient underdog to push against. The recipe was cruel and familiar. The girl's name was Leticia Santos. She had accompanied her mother, Dona Carmen, who had cleaned these halls for more than a decade and knew every stain and scuff by heart. On special event days, Leticia carried napkins and helped stack cups, careful with time so she could read between shifts in a corner of a library. She had grown up in the echoes of this campus without ever being seen by it. She looked at the screen and felt a tremor in her chest. Not fear. Recognition. Lines, curves, crossings, negative space. The shapes on the stone were not cold to her. They hummed with stories she had heard on quiet Sundays when her great-grandfather's hands moved in the air as if the past were a kite still tugging at its string. Those afternoons had held the tender gravity of memory, the careful transfer of a fire that must not go out. The conference had drawn heavy names, sharp minds, and softer hearts who still flinched when arrogance turned the room into an arena. The red laser taunted the inscription and drifted back toward the girl again. Every eye followed. Tension built like static, tiny and invisible, until hair would have lifted if anyone had dared to breathe. A hush dropped so complete that the HVAC hum sounded like a distant drum. Even the phones stopped buzzing. Leticia's mother moved first. A protective hand, a small shake of her head, the muscle memory of 1,000 times telling her child to keep her brilliance tucked away where it would be safe. People like them had rules. Be small. Be quick. Be careful. Do not attract storms. Leticia felt the rule and felt it break. The symbols on the screen didn't belong to the storm. They belonged to her people. The auditorium expanded and contracted around a single choice. The girl stepped forward, steady in a way that did not look like 16. She moved down the aisle between scholars' notes and scuffed leather bags, past the cameras that had come for the performance but were about to document something else entirely. She climbed the stage stairs with calm hands and a gaze that let the room know she would not be tossed around by anyone's contempt. She didn't take the microphone to perform. She took it to preserve. The stone filled the screen. The symbols looked like a laced braid of influences, faint echoes of archaic Portuguese, shards of indigenous syntax, traces of West African rhythm hidden in the spaces between marks. To most of the room it had felt like a dead end. To Leticia it felt like a door she had been trained to open. She explained the misreadings in simple steps, the way her great-grandfather, Samuel Santos, had taught her to untangle a knot by finding the first true thread. The mark the scholars had been calling a mountain was not a noun at all. It was a shelter marker, a semantically protective sign layered over actual reference points to confuse pursuers. The mark everyone assumed meant River Red instead as a conditional path, a ritualized metaphor used in clandestine routes when directions had to be spoken in ways that would hide their meaning in plain sight. The first line, she clarified, did not describe a landscape. It located a promise. Where the disappearing path meets the place to hide, the free leave names for the children who will come. Pens hit paper. Laptops woke. A rustle moved through the audience, the sound of minds reconfiguring. Expressions shifted from practiced detachment to unguarded awe. A professor in the second row leaned forward with both hands clasped as if to keep from interrupting. Another found tears gathering without warning. Letitia had more than memory. She had evidence. From the pocket of a well-worn work jacket she drew a notebook softened by time and use. She had protected it for years the way people protect photographs of those who taught them how to carry the world. She opened it to symbols her great-grandfather had recorded by candlelight in a one-room house. Grids showed transliteration. Arrows showed tone. Margins held comparisons to Yoruba phonology, to Kimbundu, to Tupi-Guarani particle behavior. The entries were dated, cross-referenced, and rigorous in a way that put to rest any lazy thought about folklore as anything less than science practiced under constraint. Another wave moved the room. The face of an established scholar in the front row softened, then sharpened. Recognition lit the eyes that had spent a career in African linguistics. The name Samuel Santos traveled across memory like a spark over dry grass. An elder who had published work in the 1980s, then left academia when he felt its doors closing to the very communities whose knowledge it claimed to seek. A legend whispered in citations. A teacher whose final work had been to keep language alive in living rooms and community centers while journals looked elsewhere. Letitia kept guiding the room. She traced the inscription's second line and revealed a temporal marker the panel had mistaken for a verb ending. It designated messages to descendants, not contemporaries. The stone did not simply tell a story. It sent instructions to those who would come when danger had passed. The third line, read properly, contained what looked like coordinates only if one assumed coordinates had to be geographic. They weren't. They were linguistic coordinates, clusters of features that would only appear in communities where code had survived intact enough to be recognized. An auditorium that had enjoyed a spectacle now found itself witnessing a restoration. The air changed. On stage, the famous Polyglot forced a smile that had nowhere to go. The room was no longer orbiting his certainty. It was no longer his show. Cameras, initially angled upward to flatter, began to find a new subject. The red laser pointer fell to his side and clicked off. He was left holding a small piece of plastic that had stopped obeying him, a cheap prop with no power now that the real work had started. The first thumbnail-worthy moment landed there. A wide shot. A girl in a work uniform standing beneath an image of a stone that had refused to speak, opening it for everyone. The red dot gone. The scholar to her left blinking back tears. The famous man shrinking within a suit that had looked invincible an hour earlier. Letitia advanced the slide. A meticulous presentation filled the screen, titled with clean fonts and patient maps. Linguistic Mapping of the Quilombos of Minas Gerais, an international collaborative study. It listed research sites, team logistics, methods for data integrity, analytic pathways. It displayed heat maps showing clusters of features that matched the stone's dialect signatures. It documented 17 separate inscriptions across 4 municipalities, each one cross-validated with community oral histories. The lead author name glowed in a way the auditorium was not ready for. L. Silva. The pseudonym many in the field had been citing without a face. A name frequently attached to Oxford University's Department of Applied Linguistics. A name that had carried rigor and care without biography. Faces in the audience changed again, like clouds opening. The second thumbnail-worthy moment settled on screens and inside phones, a slide showing the yellowed notebook beside a modern dataset, an arc drawn between them with dates at either end. The caption marked a lineage of knowledge that the Academy had not nurtured but would now need to honor. The image screamed story to any editor and screamed truth to anyone with a conscience. Letitia narrated the years. 12 years old and testing phonotactics by matching candomblé chants to old transcriptions. 13 and emailing anonymized samples to mentors who evaluated without prejudice because they had no hint of the sender's youth or class. 14. And receiving a cautious invitation to collaborate formally as a junior contributor. 15. And co-authoring methods that would be cited for their ethical clarity. 16. And standing in a room where someone had tried to make her small while her work was already large. She did not grandstand. She built. The scholar whose domain was African languages asked to examine the notebook and trembled as she paged through. The careful diagrams felt familiar not because she had seen them, but because they met the standard of care she trusted. She looked up at the room and nodded without performance. The room accepted the nod like a gavel. In the seats, the famous Polyglot sat down. He had no script for this. The TV rehearsals in his head flickered and died. He realized how many times he had confused fluency with wisdom, airtime with authority, applause with accuracy. He realized how often he had paused to let his voice sink into a microphone just so the clip would be clean and shareable. He realized the worst thing. He had been comfortable shining brightest when the light should have been on others. The third thumbnail-worthy moment came when the projection shifted to an email thread and a date stamp in the top corner matched a memory the famous man had hoped no one would ever connect. He had reached out to Oxford weeks earlier seeking quick insight for his talk and had asked to deal only with senior researchers. He had done it with the same assumption that greased many doors for him while shutting many others for people who never got to knock. The camera caught his face when he recognized his own request on the screen. There was nowhere to look away. Consequences did what consequences do. They multiplied with eyes on them. The clip of the auditorium went online before the afternoon coffee break ended. A student posted a 2-minute cut that captured the pivot from cruelty to correction. A professor posted a longer version with captions and context. A journalist waiting for a quote sent a link to the newsroom. The title practically wrote itself and then improved with each share. The view count climbed like a fever. Comment threads filled with declarations and confessions and mirror-held-up reactions. The university's ethics committee opened a file. The conference organizer drafted a statement. The TV producer who had booked the famous man for next week placed a call with practiced regret. Letitia finished her reading of the stone and mapped its coordinates to 3 communities that had been waiting for acknowledgement. The address was not street and number. The address was sound pattern and shared practice and knowledge kept alive by women who had not been asked to speak into microphones. The room saw what the stone had been trying to do for 2 centuries. It had been handing its voice to a descendant who could carry it without breaking it. The right translator had finally arrived, through a path no algorithm would have predicted. The moment did not end there. The auditorium shifted into something the agenda had not scheduled. Scholars asked careful questions with humility. Students asked urgent ones with curiosity. Administrators called for coffee and stayed for accountability. A map of Minas Gerais glowed on the screen like a promise about to be kept. Outside the hall, in a hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and printer ink, the famous man stood under a poster of his own face advertising a keynote that would no longer happen. He had built a career on being the safest pair of hands for a camera. He had done good work, but he had also done harm the way tall buildings cast shadows without noticing the cold below. He remembered a moment at the start of his career when an elder had corrected him gently and he had listened. Somewhere along the way, listening had become optional, then rare, then performative. He understood in one slow, humbling wave that the most dangerous point on any curve is the plateau a person mistakes for the summit. Inside, the underdog he had tried to shrink kept doing the work. By dusk, the campus felt like a small city holding its breath. The sunset flamed through the windows and stained the floor with orange. A janitor mop glittered in it as if the world were blessing every unrecognized labor at once. Letitia and her mother walked home under jacaranda trees, their purple blossoms littering the sidewalk like confetti nobody had ordered but everyone deserved. News did its thing. Headlines pushed his name. Then they pushed hers. Photos captured the contrast in a way that was too easy but still true. The famous man's brand turned brittle. Invitations thinned. Sponsors reconsidered. The morning shows filled the empty slot with a story about youth and genius that managed to celebrate without examining the systems that had almost chewed her up before anyone knew her name. The university met. The title committee met. The ethics committee met longer. Letitia kept working. She coordinated with elders in Minas Gerais, handling consent forms and travel with the precision of someone who recognized that power without consent is just a prettier version of theft. She documented inscriptions the way archivists do when they know they are building a bridge between families and libraries. She hired translators and paid stipends with grant money that had been hard to raise and would now be easier to find. She trained undergraduate volunteers from the very rooms that had once ignored her as she stacked cups in the back. She also took time to sit with her mother and drink sweet coffee at the same small table where they paid bills and dreamed. They cried and laughed and planned and worried. They held each other the way generations survive storm after storm, by linking arms and facing it together. The famous Polyglot spent nights in a quiet apartment that felt louder than any arena where he had spoken. He watched the clip and flinched at himself. He paused it on the moment the red laser touched the girl's uniform and wanted to reach into the screen and stop his own hand. He pulled old papers from his shelf and found citations that were correct but incomplete, footnotes that pointed toward communities but never knocked on their doors. He saw how his early wonder had been trimmed to fit camera segments and how he had grown proud of the trimming. He wrote an apology that night and threw it away in the morning. It had too many explanations and not enough cost. The next day, he reached out not to a PR firm but to the people he had hurt. He called the conference organizer and asked to meet with the student committee he had mocked from the stage with a throwaway joke he didn't even remember making. He called the department chair not to defend himself but to submit himself. He called a grant officer to ask what it would take to redirect the funds still associated with his name to students whose names nobody knew yet. He sold a car he loved and closed an investment he was proud of and turned the money into scholarships named for people whose hands were calloused by work that keeps institutions standing. He asked if he could speak with Letitia. Not on camera. Not for a clip. In a small office with the blinds half open and the light slanting in like forgiveness does when it finally finds a crack. She agreed with conditions. She set them with the clarity of someone who had watched words get twisted for sport. No cameras. No narrative spin. No rescue fantasy. No centering. Only a plan and receipts. They met on a Wednesday that smelled like rain. He listened. He wrote down instructions. He asked for homework. He learned the difference between a gesture and a change. The fragile détente between them became a blueprint he would follow or break at his own peril. He recorded a statement after that meeting. He kept it simple. He named what he had done. He named the harm. He named who taught him. He named the cost he was willing to carry for however long the consequences chose to walk with him. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not demand closure. He detailed actions, resignations, repayments, retractions, reassignments of credit, and the transfer of royalties from a best-selling book to a community archive fund administered by people who did not owe him thanks. The statement did not go viral. The clip already had that job. But it reached the people it needed to reach, and it started to loosen a knot tangled by pride. The work moved forward. Minas Gerais welcomed the team like family finally recognized. Letitia stood on a hill at golden hour and watched light pour over red earth and low houses and the faces of elders who had waited too long to hold proof that their codes had not died. She breathed in a smell that felt like ceremony. She opened her notebook and added a new line next to one her great-grandfather had written beside a lamp. The handwriting looked different, but the purpose did not. She presented preliminary results at a community center first, not a conference. Children sat up front, legs swinging. Grandmothers in headscarves nodded at the cadence of words that matched songs they had hummed while cooking. Teenagers filmed with phones held low. An elderly man raised a hand to ask a question whose answer made the room laugh with relief. The applause felt like a blessing rather than an achievement. The famous man attended quietly at the back, unannounced, unimportant. He carried chairs. He swept afterward. He took instruction from a volunteer who looked no older than he had been when he thought deference was something owed to him by default. He slipped out without selfies and drove home in a ride share he could now afford and had chosen to prefer. In the back seat, he felt a small click inside that sounded like pride when it finally finds its proper size. He co-signed grant applications with his signature placed where it would help rather than overshadow. He taught workshops in rural schools not as a headliner but as an assistant under Letitia's direction, introducing basic phonetics to kids who had never heard the word before and then stepping aside when a grandmother walked in with a story that would teach more than any slide. He cried twice that first month and did not hide it. He smiled without needing applause and found it startlingly light. A television network dangled a redemption arc segment. He declined. The airtime would have been about him. The work was not. By early spring, the project had gathered momentum that no single person could have produced alone. A coalition formed across departments and cities. Law students helped with access rights. Archivists trained undergraduate volunteers in conservation techniques. A documentary crew offered to film under community control, with final cut belonging to the people whose history it documented. The university announced a program for language preservation led by those who had lived the preservation long before funding learned its name. The faculty senate approved it with a vote that felt like a course correction. Letitia's mother, who had spent 2 decades invisible in that same building, walked into the newly announced cultural center as its coordinator. She received a key and a budget and a timetable. She hired other mothers and grandfathers and teens, each with skills the old lists had never bothered to include. She stood in a sunlit room full of books and instruments and posters and took a breath that unspooled 20 years of holding it. The famous man watched from a bench in the hallway and understood that this was the picture his life had needed. Humility seated and learning while dignity took its rightful place at the table. He felt grateful in a way he would not have understood months earlier. The first major paper was prepared for publication with unusual care. It listed authors in order of contribution, which placed Letitia first. It acknowledged elders by name. It credited Samuel Santos posthumously as a foundational source with a note that explained the difference between appropriation and inheritance. It described methods in language a teenager could understand and an elder would respect. It submitted to peer review with a cover letter that anticipated criticism and welcomed it as a chance to strengthen the work. While the review process turned, the team secured permissions for a public exhibit where the first stone would be displayed alongside modern work, bridging time with glass and captions. The exhibit design used fewer buzzwords than the brochures of old and more photographs of hands in the act of writing, weaving, teaching, holding. The lighting plan emphasized the stone without fetishizing it. The security plan accounted for the value of an object no one had valued publicly a year earlier. The famous man paid for climate-controlled cases with money he would have once used to upgrade a kitchen. He did it quietly and let the plaque carry only the names of the communities involved. He learned the pleasure of seeing something important happen and not being thanked for it. He learned the relief of living off the applause less. Letitia balanced fieldwork with high school classes and travel documents as deadlines approached. She slept less than she should have and smiled more than she used to. She recorded voice notes for children who asked for her in classrooms that had never met anyone like her. She answered emails from academics with firm boundaries and from teenagers with gentle encouragement. She chose a dress for a scholarship ceremony and laughed with her mother when they realized it had pockets deep enough to hold a pen and notebook. Then the twist arrived, late and uninvited, the way truth often brings friends that make the story less tidy and more real. In the weeks before the exhibit, a retired professor reached out with a box he had kept since the late 1980s. He had been a graduate student then, and his notes described a seminar series led by a celebrated mentor, a man who had shaped the department's prestige and the famous Polyglot's path. The box held preliminary translations of Quilombo inscriptions that looked disturbingly like the ones now attributed to the communities, along with correspondence suggesting that the mentor had discouraged publication and directed resources away from the field because it did not align with his theory. One letter implied that funding would depend on avoiding politically sensitive topics. Another hinted that community consent had been considered an obstacle rather than a requirement. The retired professor confessed that he hadn't known what to do and had done nothing. Age brought repentance. The box had brought insomnia. He asked for absolution that no one could grant and offered the archive that no one could ignore. Letitia and the team examined the materials with gloves and care and trembling. The resemblance was not theft in the strictest legal sense, but it was suppression in a moral one. The work had been closer than anyone knew, and doors had been closed deliberately. The famous polyglot read the letters and felt a heat under his skin that surfaced as shame, then anger, then resolve. He had admired that mentor. He had imitated that cadence. He had enjoyed that mailed-in confidence. He had, without knowing, benefited from someone else's decision to keep the work small. There was only one way through. The team would tell the whole truth. They prepared a supplemental chapter that documented the history of obstacles as part of the history of the language itself. They wrote about the box and the letters. They wrote about the cost of delay and the resilience that outlived it. They wrote not to cancel a person but to correct a record in favor of communities who had been corrected too many times by people in power. They chose transparency over tidy heroism. They braced for backlash and readied their evidence. The famous man requested a meeting with the current department head and the dean and the ethics committee. He brought the box. He brought receipts. He brought his own name for scrutiny. He admitted what he had not known and how that had still helped him. He requested that the department rename an award that had carried the mentor's legacy and place the new name on a scholarship for students researching community-held knowledge under community direction. He offered funding and asked for nothing in return but a public statement that told the truth. The dean asked for time. The university moved with its usual mixture of speed and caution. The committee drafted language. Lawyers reviewed. Histories were updated online, and that small administrative act felt like a hinge finally turning in an old door. Press learned what press always learns, and the story multiplied again. Some called it overdue. Some called it a witch hunt. Some found a way to make it about anything but the people in Minas Gerais, who just wanted their children to inherit words that had carried them through centuries of danger. Comment sections surged with noisy certainty. Actual elders in actual rooms served actual coffee while the world argued, and that perspective kept everyone sane. Amid noise, the moral of the work remained simple enough to teach to a child. Do not judge by appearances. Verify before you vilify. Integrity is action when no one's watching. The exhibit opened with lines out the doors and a quiet inside that honored what deserved honor. People approached the stone as if visiting a grandparent. Captions guided rather than lectured. Children traced symbols in the air and vowed to learn them the way they would learn family recipes. A reporter asked a good question about the difference between preservation and display, and the answer steered visitors toward the community center that was running weekly classes taught by elders, now paid properly and treated as faculty. The famous man stood near the back again, near a small sign that listed emergency exits and reminded him that humility is both an entrance and a way out. He felt a gratitude that didn't need eyes on it. He watched Letitia and her mother stand together in front of the stone, hands linked the way stories link centuries. By evening, the exhibit lights dimmed. The team stayed to debrief and share food at folding tables. Laughter stretched the day. Someone passed around a phone to show a comment from a teenager in a mining town who had watched the clip months earlier and decided to stay in school. Someone else shared a voice note from an elder who cried on hearing his mother tongue described as a system instead of a superstition. The room filled with those small, consequential reasons anyone keeps doing hard work. The famous man lifted a paper cup and whispered a private thanks to the quiet that had finally taught him how to be useful. Midweek brought the peer review decision. Major revision requested, as expected, with sharp, thoughtful notes that improved the work. The team cheered the way people cheer at an honest game well played. They got back to it with energy instead of defensiveness. They met in a classroom with bad lighting and great whiteboards and mapped the revisions beat by beat. They finished late and walked outside arm in arm, laughing like people who had chosen good company and could carry weight together. Then the room went cold. An email arrived at dawn from the museum's security vendor. The tone was clipped. The cameras had glitched between 2:37 and 2:41 a.m. The feed returned clean afterward. No motion alarms had tripped. Everything looked normal. Almost. The case display was wrong by one detail only a curator would notice. The stone had not moved. The notebook had. The notebook was gone. Another notification chimed. A law firm representing a private foundation tied to the old mentor served a cease and desist regarding the exhibit's supplemental history chapter. The letter threatened injunctions, damages, and a campaign to discredit the project. It also attached a formal complaint accusing the team of violating provenance protocols. It demanded immediate removal of materials pending an audit. Phones exploded. The dean called an emergency meeting. The ethics committee scheduled a hearing. The archive staff swarmed the exhibit room, white-gloved and wide-eyed. The famous man stood in the doorway with his jaw locked and a helplessness he had not felt since he was a student. Letitia pressed her palms to the glass case, all the breath gone from her in one instantaneous theft of air. Security scrolled through footage. Lawyers called other lawyers. The retired professor who had delivered the box left 3 voicemails in a row, his voice cracked with dread. The community partners texted, "We stand with you." The comment sections roared again, hungry for spectacle, ready to consume whichever narrative rose first. On her phone, Letitia found an anonymous message in her inbox time-stamped 2 minutes after the security glitch ended. The subject line carried 3 words that turned her blood to ice. Correct the story. The body contained a single sentence and a photo taken in night vision green, the edges of the notebook visible in someone's gloved hand. The sentence warned that the next message would decide whether the past finally spoke or was silenced again. It offered terms. It demanded something impossible. It hinted at a name nobody wanted to see. The screen dimmed. The room seemed to tilt. The future of the project, the safety of elders, the reputation of a university, the fragile redemption of a man who had finally found courage, and the private promise a great-grandfather had tucked into a teenager's jacket, all of it balanced on a decision that now had to be made with care and speed. The day outside the window shone indecently bright for the kind of storm gathering. The phone buzzed again. A second email appeared, and eyes in the room tracked the notification as if watching a wire deliver a verdict. The subject line offered no comfort. Audit initiated. Part 2 waits in the doorway. A viral backlash and a lawsuit are already pounding. An audit walks in with a folder full of suspicion. A key piece of evidence has vanished into the hands of someone who wants to write history with threats. The next choice will cost something precious, and it will test every moral